Imagine trying to govern millions of people without modern technology. No electricity, no instant communication, no centralized databases, no rapid transportation. And yet, for centuries, China managed populations larger than most of the world combined, without collapsing into chaos. This wasn't luck, and it wasn't simple force. Ancient China faced a problem that very few societies in history ever solved: how to keep order, food distribution, taxation, labor, and authority functioning across enormous distances and dense populations, generation after generation. Many civilizations grew large. Very few stayed large. This video is about the quiet systems that made that possible. Not heroic emperors, not famous battles, but routines, records, labor organization, and control mechanisms that worked slowly, consistently, and relentlessly. Systems so effective that most people living inside them barely noticed they were being managed at all. Once you understand how ancient China handled population on this scale, modern government starts to look less impressive, and ancient administration starts to look disturbingly advanced. Before we continue, I'm curious, what country are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Write it in the comments. It's interesting to see how a topic about ancient population reaches modern ones across the world. If you enjoy history that explains how systems actually worked, not just who ruled them, like the video and subscribe. These stories build slowly, and the most important details come later. Now let's look at how one of the largest populations in human history was managed long before modern tools existed. When people imagine ancient China governing massive populations, they often picture overwhelming authority imposed from the top. An emperor issuing commands, officials enforcing rules, and the population obeying. This image feels intuitive, but it is misleading. The real achievement of ancient China was not raw control. It was the creation of order that reduced the need for constant force. Managing millions of people across vast territory required something far more durable than fear. It required predictability. From very early on, Chinese states understood a fundamental reality. People are easier to govern when daily life is stable, repetitive, and legible to authority. The goal was not to micromanage individuals, but to make society readable. Once society was readable, it could be regulated with minimal intervention. This principle shaped everything. The foundation of population management was agriculture. Large populations only remain stable when food production is reliable and predictable. Ancient Chinese administrations invested enormous effort into organizing land use, irrigation, and seasonal labor. This was not about innovation for its own sake. It was about smoothing variability. Floods and droughts were inevitable. What mattered was how regularly food could be moved, stored, and redistributed. Systems were built to track harvests, predict shortages, and mobilize labor when needed. These systems did not eliminate disaster, but they reduced its impact enough to prevent collapse. Food security was governance. Once food was stabilized, population density became manageable rather than dangerous. People settled. Settled people are easier to count, tax, and organize than mobile ones. Stability reduced migration. Reduced migration increased administrative control. This is where ancient China diverged from many other large societies. Instead of relying primarily on coercion, it relied on structure. Structure made behavior predictable. Predictability allowed planning. Planning allowed scale. Administrative divisions were carefully layered. Territory was broken down into increasingly smaller units, each with clearly defined responsibilities. Local officials were responsible for knowing who lived where, what land they worked, and what obligations they owed. Higher levels did not manage individuals directly. They managed information. Information was power. Records mattered enormously. Census taking, land registration, and household tracking were not occasional activities. They were continuous processes. Households were grouped, documented, and revisited regularly. This did not require modern technology. It required consistency. Consistency replaced speed. Once households were registered, obligations became enforceable without constant oversight. Taxes, labor duties, and local regulations were attached to status rather than negotiated each time. People knew what was expected of them, and officials knew what to demand. This reduced friction. Friction is dangerous in large populations. Too much friction creates resistance. Ancient Chinese systems aimed to minimize friction by making obligations routine rather than arbitrary. Routine normalizes compliance. The household was the core unit of governance. Rather than treating individuals as isolated subjects, the state treated households as collective entities. Responsibility was shared internally. This reduced the need for external enforcement. If one member failed, the household addressed it. This internal regulation was efficient. It aligned social pressure with administrative goals. People monitored themselves and each other because their obligations were tied together. This approach scaled well because it distributed enforcement across society. Distributed enforcement is cheaper than centralized force. Labor organization followed the same logic. Large-scale projects required enormous manpower, but they were not organized chaotically. Labor obligations were assigned based on household registration and seasonal availability. People were mobilized when agricultural demand was low, reducing disruption. This integration of governance with agricultural rhythm was crucial. It prevented the state from competing with survival. When governance aligns with daily life, resistance decreases. Ancient Chinese administrators understood this deeply. Population management also relied on standardization. Measures, units, and procedures were unified to the extent possible. This was not about cultural uniformity. It was about administrative clarity. When everyone measures land, grain, and labor in the same way, disputes decrease. Decreased disputes reduce the burden on courts and officials. Less burden means systems can scale without collapsing. Standardization creates legibility. Legibility allows control at a distance. Distance was one of the greatest challenges. Ancient China covered enormous territory. Communication was slow. Officials could not rely on constant supervision from the center. This meant local systems had to function reliably on their own. Reliability mattered more than innovation. Officials were expected to follow established procedures rather than improvise. Deviations created uncertainty. Uncertainty invited abuse or resistance. Procedure created continuity across generations. Continuity allowed population growth. Another critical factor was the separation between ideology and administration. Rulers came and went. Dynasties changed, but administrative routines persisted. This continuity insulated population management from political instability. Even when central authority weakened, local systems often continued functioning. This prevented sudden collapse. Ancient China did not depend on charismatic leadership to manage population. It depended on systems that outlived leaders. Systems are quieter than power. This quietness is why modern observers often underestimate their effectiveness. Punishment existed, but it was not the primary tool of population control. Punishment was reserved for deviation from routine, not for routine compliance. Most people live their entire lives interacting with administration in predictable, nonviolent ways. Predictable interaction builds acceptance. Acceptance does not mean enthusiasm. It means tolerance. Tolerance is sufficient for governance. Education also played a role, but not in the modern sense. Administrative literacy mattered more than philosophical learning. Officials needed to read, record, calculate, and report accurately. This created a professional administrative class whose power came from competence rather than force. Competence scales. Officials were evaluated based on performance, not lineage alone. This reduced corruption at the margins and increased system stability. While corruption existed, it did not define the system. A corrupt system cannot manage massive populations for long. Ancient China managed population not by controlling every action, but by controlling the framework within which actions occurred. People lived within systems that guided behavior automatically. Guidance is more sustainable than coercion. This framework reduced the need for constant intervention. The state did not need to watch everyone. It needed to watch patterns. Deviations from patterns signaled problems. Patterns are easier to manage than people. Population density also created advantages. Dense populations made administration more efficient. Officials could reach more people with less travel. Information traveled faster within communities. Collective norms formed more easily. Density amplifies structure. Large populations became self-regulating once basic systems were in place. This is the key insight. Ancient China did not manage massive populations by overpowering them. It managed them by embedding governance into daily life so deeply that it became invisible. Invisibility is the highest form of control. People complied not because they were constantly forced, but because compliance felt normal, expected, and unavoidable. This normality is what allowed ancient China to sustain population sizes that overwhelmed other societies. The system did not need to be perfect. It needed to be consistent. And consistency, applied over centuries, proved stronger than force. Once basic order was established, ancient Chinese population management moved from survival to maintenance. This stage is where many other large societies failed. Feeding people is one challenge. Keeping millions of people predictable, taxable, and socially stable over long periods is another entirely. Ancient China succeeded here not through constant innovation, but through institutional patience. The central idea was simple: reduce unpredictability at every level of life. Unpredictability is expensive for governments. It requires reaction. Reaction consumes resources. A system that constantly reacts eventually collapses. Ancient Chinese administrations worked instead to flatten variation. They did not try to eliminate difference completely, but they reduced it enough that problems appeared early and locally rather than suddenly and system-wide. Local responsibility was the key mechanism. Villages, districts, and counties were not passive recipients of orders. They were active units of management. Local officials were expected to know their population intimately: who lived where, who worked which land, who owed labor, who had migrated, who had died. This knowledge did not exist in the abstract. It was constantly updated through routine reporting. Reporting was not occasional. It was habitual. Habit is what allowed scale. By making information flow upward regularly, higher levels of administration could make decisions without needing to observe conditions directly. They managed summaries rather than people. This is crucial. No central authority can directly manage millions of individuals. It can only manage representations of them. Ancient China perfected representation. Population became numbers, households, and obligations rather than faces. This abstraction did not erase human experience, but it allowed governance to function. When the state thought in terms of households and land units, it could plan, allocate, and intervene efficiently. Abstraction reduces emotional friction. The household system also allowed responsibility to be internalized. When obligations were collective, households regulated themselves. Families enforced compliance because non-compliance harmed everyone. This shifted enforcement costs away from the state. Self-regulation is the cheapest form of control. The state intervened primarily when self-regulation failed. This kept coercion targeted rather than constant. Targeted enforcement feels less oppressive than universal surveillance, even when underlying control is extensive. This approach stabilized large populations psychologically as well as administratively. Another crucial factor was the normalization of obligation. Taxes, labor duties, and service requirements were framed as expected rhythms of life rather than exceptional impositions. When obligation is predictable, people plan around it. When it is arbitrary, people resist. Resistance grows from surprise. Ancient Chinese systems minimized surprise. Calendars mattered. Agricultural cycles were aligned with administrative cycles. Labor obligations were scheduled when agricultural demand was lowest. This prevented the state from competing with survival. When governance respects survival rhythms, legitimacy increases automatically. Legitimacy reduced enforcement needs. Infrastructure played a subtle but decisive role. Roads, canals, and storage facilities were not just economic assets. They were administrative tools. They allowed food to move, information to travel, and officials to rotate. Movement created visibility. Visibility created accountability. Accountability kept systems honest enough to function. Perfect honesty was unnecessary. Predictable behavior was sufficient. Even punishment reflected this logic. Harsh penalties existed, but they were rarely random. Punishment followed clear categories of deviation. People knew which actions crossed lines. This clarity reduced fear of arbitrary authority and replaced it with calculation. Calculation produces compliance. People comply more readily when they understand consequences. Ancient Chinese governance relied heavily on classification. People were classified by household status, landholding, occupation, and obligation. Classification made governance manageable. It reduced individuality into administrable units. Modern observers often interpret this as dehumanizing. Historically, it was functional. Functionality allowed survival at scale. The system also minimized direct confrontation between state and individual. Most interactions occurred through local intermediaries. This buffered authority. People dealt with officials they knew, rather than distant rulers. Familiarity softened control. Soft control lasts longer than hard control. Local officials were crucial, but they were also monitored. Performance evaluation existed in basic form. Officials were judged on outcomes: tax collection, labor fulfillment, order maintenance. This created incentive alignment. Officials who failed risked removal. Removal preserved system integrity. Crucially, these evaluations focused on stability rather than innovation. Officials were rewarded for keeping things functioning, not for changing them. This discouraged experimentation but preserved continuity. Continuity was the priority. Population growth itself became manageable because systems scaled gradually. Growth was absorbed by existing structures rather than forcing redesign. This prevented administrative shock. Shock destroys systems. Even during periods of dynastic change, administrative routines often persisted. New rulers inherited systems rather than building new ones from scratch. This continuity insulated population management from political upheaval. Insulation prevented collapse. Many empires fell not because they lost control suddenly, but because administrative breakdown preceded political failure. Ancient China avoided this pattern repeatedly by protecting routine. Routine is invisible power. Another overlooked element was the limitation of ambition. Ancient Chinese governance rarely attempted to extract maximum value from population. It aimed for sustainable extraction. Overexploitation creates rebellion. Underexploitation weakens the state. Balance preserved longevity. Longevity mattered more than dominance. The state accepted inefficiency in exchange for stability. Some tax went uncollected. Some corruption existed. These losses were tolerated because aggressive enforcement risked unrest. This restraint preserved overall control. Restraint is a form of strength. Large populations amplify consequences. Small errors scale into large problems. Ancient administrators understood this intuitively. They avoided dramatic reforms. Change occurred slowly, through accumulation rather than decree. Accumulation avoids backlash. This conservative approach explains why ancient Chinese population management appears rigid. Rigidity was intentional. Flexibility at scale can be dangerous. Rigid systems are predictable. Predictability stabilizes expectations. Expectation management is population management. When people know what tomorrow will demand, they prepare. Preparation reduces panic. Panic destabilizes society. Ancient China focused relentlessly on reducing panic. Famine relief, while imperfect, followed recognizable patterns. Labor obligations adjusted. Taxes deferred. These adjustments were not benevolent gestures. They were system preservation. Preservation was rational. The success of these methods is visible historically. While dynasties rose and fell, population density often rebounded rather than dispersing permanently. This indicates that people trusted systems enough to remain. Remaining is compliance. Migration is resistance. Ancient China reduced migration by stabilizing local life. When people stay put, they are easier to manage. Mobility threatens governance. Thus, settlement was encouraged. All of these mechanisms combined into something remarkable: a society where millions of people lived under governance so normalized that it rarely needed to announce itself. Control was embedded, not imposed daily. This is the core achievement. Ancient China managed massive populations not by overpowering them, but by shaping the conditions under which daily life unfolded. People did not wake up thinking about government. They woke up inside it. Inside routines. Inside expectations. Inside obligations. That is how scale was achieved. Not through spectacle, not through constant force, but through systems that made obedience ordinary and resistance impractical. This quiet effectiveness is why ancient Chinese population management remains one of the most enduring administrative achievements in history. And it sets the stage for understanding how such systems survived crises, rebellions, and dynastic change, which is where the next chapter leads. One of the most important reasons China was able to manage extraordinarily large populations over long periods was its ability to make society legible. Legibility does not mean understanding every individual. It means structuring society so that behavior, resources, and obligations can be observed, predicted, and adjusted without constant intervention. Ancient Chinese governance focused relentlessly on this goal. Legibility begins with categorization. People were not governed as unique individuals with shifting personal circumstances. They were governed as members of households, villages, and administrative units. This reduced complexity. Instead of managing millions of people, the state managed millions of units that behaved in broadly predictable ways. Predictability mattered more than precision. Household registration formed the backbone of this system. Every household was recorded, revisited, and updated. These records were not static lists. They were living documents that tracked changes over time. Births, deaths, marriages, land transfers, and relocations were noted because they altered obligations. This allowed administrators to see population movement without seeing people directly. Once households were registered, everything else followed naturally. Taxes were calculated per household. Labor duties were assigned per household. Resource needs were estimated per household. The household became the interface between the individual and the state. This approach reduced administrative load dramatically. Instead of chasing individuals, officials worked with local records. These records made population size visible without requiring constant census taking. Visibility allowed planning. Planning allowed stability. Stability reduced friction. Another key element was territorial division. Land was divided into nested administrative layers, each with defined responsibility. Small units handled daily oversight. Larger units aggregated information. Central authorities dealt with patterns rather than events. This hierarchy allowed problems to be resolved locally whenever possible. Only when issues exceeded local capacity did they move upward. This prevented central overload and kept governance responsive without being chaotic. Responsiveness was controlled. Local officials were expected to know their area thoroughly. This knowledge was practical rather than abstract. Officials knew which households were reliable, which struggled, and which needed attention. This familiarity reduced the need for drastic measures. Small adjustments could be made early. Early adjustment prevents large disruption. Information flow was continuous but measured. Reports moved upward regularly, but not constantly. This rhythm prevented panic. Sudden changes stood out clearly against stable background data. Clear signals allowed targeted response. Targeted response is efficient. The system also relied heavily on routine. Obligations followed calendars. Calendars followed seasons. When obligations align with natural rhythms, compliance feels normal rather than imposed. People plan around what they expect. Expectation shapes behavior. When people expect certain duties at certain times, resistance decreases. The obligation becomes part of life rather than an interruption. Ancient Chinese administration embedded duties into everyday routines so deeply that they felt inevitable. Inevitability reduces resistance. Standardization further enhanced legibility. Measures of land, grain, and labor were unified as much as possible. This reduced disputes and simplified reporting. When everyone uses the same units, misunderstandings decrease. Decreased misunderstanding reduces administrative cost. The system did not require perfection. Small inaccuracies were tolerated because overall patterns mattered more. What mattered was trend, not exception. Trend-based governance scales. Another crucial feature was indirect management. The state did not interact constantly with individuals. It worked through intermediaries, local elders, heads of households, and officials. These intermediaries translated administrative requirements into social expectation. Social expectation is powerful. When obligation is enforced socially rather than administratively, compliance increases without increasing cost. People respond more readily to familiar authority than distant command. This is why ancient Chinese governance emphasized local responsibility. Local communities regulated themselves because their obligations were collective. If one household failed, others were affected. This created internal pressure to comply. Internal pressure is cheaper than external enforcement. The system also minimized arbitrary change. Rules changed slowly. Procedures persisted across generations. This continuity allowed people to build long-term strategies for meeting obligations. Long-term planning reduces anxiety. Reduced anxiety stabilizes population. Population stability itself became a governance tool. When people remain settled, records remain accurate. Accurate records make administration easier. Administration that works encourages people to stay. Mobility complicates governance. Ancient China discouraged unnecessary movement not through constant restriction, but through stability. When local life is predictable and sustainable, people do not seek alternatives. Seeking alternatives is a sign of system failure. Infrastructure quietly supported legibility. Roads, canals, and storage facilities were not just economic assets. They allowed information, resources, and officials to move efficiently. Movement created visibility. Visibility supported accountability. Accountability sustained trust. Trust does not require affection. It requires reliability. When systems behave predictably, people adjust. Ancient Chinese administration prioritized reliability over speed or innovation. Innovation introduces uncertainty. Uncertainty destabilizes large populations. This conservative approach explains the longevity of administrative structures. Even when leadership changed, routines continued. This continuity prevented sudden collapse and allowed population recovery after disruption. Recovery depends on structure. Another important aspect was performance monitoring of officials. Officials were assessed based on outcomes rather than intentions. If records were inaccurate or obligations unmet, responsibility was traced. This created incentive alignment. Alignment reduced negligence. The evaluation process focused on maintaining order rather than achieving perfection. Officials were not rewarded for aggressive extraction or dramatic reform. They were rewarded for stability. Stability was success. This emphasis prevented administrative escalation. Escalation often creates backlash. Backlash disrupts systems. Ancient Chinese governance avoided escalation whenever possible. Avoidance is a strategy. The system also accepted limited inefficiency. Some loss was tolerated because eliminating it completely would cost more than it saved. This balance preserved long-term functionality. Long-term thinking defined success. Large populations magnify small mistakes. Ancient administrators understood this intuitively. They preferred slow, steady adjustment over rapid change. Rapid change risks systemic stress. By embedding governance into daily routines, ancient China created a population that lived inside administration rather than reacting to it. People did not experience governance as a series of interventions. They experienced it as background structure. Background structure is invisible power. This invisibility is why the system appears less dramatic than others. There were no constant displays. No need for spectacle. Governance worked quietly. Quiet systems last. This approach also allowed adaptation without collapse. When conditions shifted, adjustments were made within existing frameworks. New procedures were layered onto old ones rather than replacing them. Layering preserves continuity. Continuity supports trust. Trust reduces friction. Friction threatens scale. Scale was the challenge ancient China solved, not by overwhelming society, but by shaping it into something that could be observed, predicted, and gently guided. This is the essence of legibility-based governance. It does not eliminate difficulty. It manages it. And that management, applied patiently over centuries, made it possible for ancient China to sustain population sizes that overwhelmed most other societies. Legibility did not end with counting people and land. It had to be maintained continuously, especially during stress. The true test of any population management system is not how it performs in stable conditions, but how it behaves when conditions deteriorate. Ancient Chinese governance proved durable because it anticipated stress and absorbed it through routines rather than improvisation. Stress took many forms. Weather disruptions reduced harvests. Local disputes escalated. Migration threatened records. Officials failed or abused authority. Each of these could destabilize a large population if handled clumsily. The administrative response was not dramatic intervention, but procedural containment. Containment worked because systems were designed to localize problems. When a harvest failed in one area, the failure was recorded at the local level first. The information moved upward in measured steps. Higher authorities did not immediately impose sweeping solutions. They compared reports, verified trends, and assessed whether the problem was isolated or systemic. This prevented overreaction. Overreaction is costly in large systems. Relief measures, when necessary, were integrated into existing structures. Temporary adjustments to obligations, controlled redistribution, and supervised labor reassignment were used to stabilize conditions. These measures relied on records already in place. No new system needed to be invented during crisis. Crisis management depended on preparation, not speed. Preparation also meant redundancy. Administrative roles overlapped deliberately. Multiple officials tracked similar information. This reduced the impact of individual failure. If one official misreported or failed, discrepancies emerged through comparison. Errors could be corrected without collapsing the system. Redundancy is inefficiency by design. Inefficiency increases resilience. Another crucial element was procedural memory. Administrations preserved records of past responses to similar problems. This allowed officials to apply known solutions rather than invent new ones under pressure. Continuity reduced uncertainty. Uncertainty breeds panic. By minimizing panic, the system reduced resistance. People respond poorly to sudden, unfamiliar demands. They respond better to adjustments that resemble previous experience. Ancient Chinese governance leaned heavily on precedent for this reason. Precedent legitimizes intervention. Legitimacy matters during stress because enforcement capacity is strained. A response seen as familiar is more likely to be accepted even when it imposes hardship. Hardship is tolerated when it feels expected. Migration posed a particular challenge to legibility. Movement disrupts records. Disrupted records undermine planning. Rather than attempting to prevent all movement, the system focused on tracking and reintegration. Migrants were recorded where they arrived. Their obligations were reassigned. The goal was not immobilization, but visibility. Visibility maintains control. By allowing movement to be documented rather than suppressed, the system avoided creating hidden populations. Hidden populations are dangerous because they cannot be planned for. Visible movement can be absorbed. This approach also reduced the need for harsh enforcement. When people believe they can re-enter the system, they are less likely to evade it completely. Inclusion supports compliance. Inclusion was practical, not ideological. Local mediation played a critical role in maintaining legibility. Disputes were resolved at the lowest possible level. This prevented escalation and reduced the burden on higher authorities. Resolution focused on restoring routine rather than assigning blame. Restoring routine stabilizes population. Courts and officials prioritized settlements that allowed obligations to continue. Punishment existed, but it was calibrated to avoid removing productive members from the system unnecessarily. Removing people creates gaps. Gaps disrupt records. Disruption threatens legibility. Thus, punishment was selective. Selective punishment preserves capacity. Administrative language reinforced this mindset. Reports emphasized status, condition, and capacity rather than moral judgment. Officials described what existed and what was needed, not who deserved blame. This practical framing reduced conflict. Conflict is expensive. The evaluation of officials followed similar logic. Performance was judged on stability indicators, accurate records, predictable obligations, absence of unrest. Officials were not rewarded for extracting maximum resources. They were rewarded for maintaining continuity. Restraint was institutionalized. Large-scale projects provide a clear example of how legibility and restraint combined. When labor was required, it was drawn from registered households according to established quotas. Timing was coordinated with agricultural cycles. Oversight ensured participation was distributed rather than concentrated. Distribution prevents resentment. Resentment undermines compliance. Because labor demands followed known patterns, participation felt obligatory rather than arbitrary. People anticipated it. Anticipation reduces shock. Shock destabilizes populations. The system also recognized limits. It did not attempt to extract more labor or resources than households could sustain indefinitely. Exhaustion reduces productivity. Reduced productivity undermines future capacity. Future capacity mattered. This long-term perspective distinguished ancient Chinese population management from more extractive models. Extraction maximizes immediate output. Management maximizes longevity. Longevity allows scale. Information discipline reinforced all of this. Officials were trained to report regularly, accurately, and conservatively. Overstating success was dangerous because it masked problems. Understating capacity was risky because it invited scrutiny. Balanced reporting preserved credibility. Credibility enabled trust. Trust allowed decentralized action without constant oversight. Local officials could act within bounds because higher authorities trusted the information they received. This trust reduced the need for intrusive supervision. Intrusive supervision does not scale. Another subtle mechanism was normalization through repetition. The same forms, procedures, and expectations were used year after year. Repetition trained both officials and population. People learned how the system behaved. This predictability reduced fear. Fear leads to resistance. Resistance complicates management. Even when leadership changed, administrative continuity often remained. New rulers relied on existing systems because rebuilding was costly and risky. This continuity insulated population management from political volatility. Insulation preserved order. It also meant that population growth did not require constant redesign. As numbers increased, existing frameworks absorbed them. New households were registered. New land was recorded. Obligations scaled naturally. Natural scaling avoids disruption. The cumulative effect of these practices was a society that remained legible even under stress. Legibility allowed targeted intervention rather than blunt force. Targeted intervention preserved compliance without exhausting authority. Authority conservation mattered. When authority is overused, it weakens. Ancient Chinese governance treated authority as a finite resource. It was deployed sparingly and predictably. Predictable authority feels less oppressive. This perception mattered. People may not have approved of obligations, but they understood them. Understanding reduces anger. Anger destabilizes large populations. The system also tolerated imperfection. Not every record was accurate. Not every obligation was fulfilled. These imperfections were absorbed rather than eliminated aggressively. Aggressive correction risked destabilization. Tolerance maintained equilibrium. Equilibrium allowed recovery after shocks. Floods, droughts, and unrest occurred, but administrative routines often survived. Survivability mattered more than efficiency. Efficiency can be rebuilt. Collapse cannot. By the time populations reached massive scale, these principles were deeply embedded. Officials expected to manage patterns, not people. People expected to live within routines, not negotiate every obligation. This mutual expectation was the system's strength. It reduced friction at every interface. Friction reduction allowed endurance. Endurance allowed continuity across centuries. This is why ancient Chinese population management cannot be understood as simple control. It was a sophisticated balance of visibility, routine, restraint, and adaptation. Control was embedded, not imposed. That embedding made governance durable. When we look back at how China managed massive populations over centuries, the most striking lesson is not the scale of authority, but the discipline of restraint. Ancient Chinese governance did not rely on constant force, spectacle, or dramatic intervention. It relied on systems that made society readable, predictable, and stable enough to govern quietly. Population was not controlled through fear alone. It was managed through routine. Households were registered. Obligations were normalized. Information moved steadily upward. Decisions moved cautiously downward. Local problems were contained before they became national crises. Authority was conserved, not spent recklessly. This approach explains why large populations did not automatically lead to chaos. Instead of trying to command every action, administrators shaped the conditions under which daily life unfolded. People lived inside governance rather than reacting to it. Compliance did not feel like submission to constant power. It felt like participation in an unavoidable structure. The system accepted imperfection. Some inefficiency was tolerated. Some loss was absorbed. Stability mattered more than maximum extraction. Longevity mattered more than speed. This long-term thinking allowed institutions to survive leadership changes, environmental stress, and social pressure without collapsing entirely. Ancient China's achievement was not that it eliminated disorder, but that it limited its spread. By keeping society legible and expectations consistent, the state could intervene selectively and effectively when needed. That selectivity preserved legitimacy and reduced resistance. In the end, Managing massive populations was less about commanding people and more about designing systems people could live inside for generations. Power was not loud. It was procedural. Control was not dramatic. It was embedded. That is why these systems lasted. Thank you for staying until the end. If this perspective changed how you think about ancient governance and large societies, support the channel by liking the video, subscribing, and sharing your thoughts in the comments.